is a funny thing. We'd raise our children to be independent young people that would grow into independent adults. And yet at the same time, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but when my children start to find that independence at every stage, I feel a little bit of grief and excitement, of course. For example, when my boys got out of diapers, I was excited, but there was also a little bit of sadness that we were out of that stage, or when they started walking, or I remember the first time I bent down to help my son tie his shoes, and he pushed my hands away, and he said, "No, Mommy, I got it." I remember one time making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and my son pushed me out of the way. "No, Mommy, I got it." And in just a few years, my boys will be driving, and then they'll be off to college, Lord willing, and then they'll be living independent lives. I remember when I went off to college, my dad cried all the way, the whole 2 miles that I went to school. He cried the whole way there. And I know that he was excited for me, but it was also a moment of realizing that his daughter had become independent. We want that. We want that for our children. We want to be independent, strong people. This idea of independence is certainly not a new one. But I gotta wonder sometimes if maybe we've taken it to the extreme. In fact, I would even contend that maybe this idea of super independence has leaked into the Christian imagination. For example, we hear some about bootstrap theology, this idea that, well, I did it. I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps. Someone else should be able to do it too. Someone else should be able to live into the American dream. Here's the wild thing. When I look at Scripture, this idea of radical independence is simply just not there. Not only that, but I think often when we think about like someone who's really independent, we think if they're really independent and they work really hard, then they'll experience blessings. They'll have health and wealth and happiness. But what's wild is that's not even in Scripture. In fact, we see a rather upside down vision. I can think of the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, for example. Jesus lists out a group of people that are not what we would think living blessed lives. Quite the opposite. You can imagine him setting a table, for example. And as he sets the table, he's telling us the types of people that we could expect to see in his kingdom. And I imagine him putting down little placards of the names of who sits at his table in the kingdom, the types of people we might be able to see. And as he sets the table, he says, "Here sits the poor in spirit. And when they sit at my table, they're blessed." And then he says, "Here sits the mourn, and here sits those who are meek, and then here sits those who are persecuted." And as he sets this table, we start to scratch our heads, and we begin to wonder, why is he calling them blessed? It's quite the opposite. These are people where they are barely keeping their neck above water. Life is way less than ideal. In fact, many of them, life is rather devastating. These are people who maybe have nothing but their own clothes on their back. And so what we discover in the Beatitudes actually is Jesus calls the radically driven or radically independent to set that aside and discover the dependence on the kingdom, no matter what. He calls the radically driven, the independent, to abandon his or her own radical independence. And so as Jesus is setting the table and telling us the kinds of people that sit there, he certainly uses some shock factor. In fact, the Pharisees of the day, when they would have made lists, they would have used the word cursed with these descriptions. They would have said, "Cursed are those who are poor in spirit. Cursed are those who mourn. Cursed are those who meek. Cursed are those who are persecuted." And they would have maybe even connected it to disobedience. Maybe these things were happening to them because they were disobedient. But Jesus is actually talking about the have-nots, and they're blessed. These are people who don't have enough money. These are people who don't have health care today. These are people who don't have the external support systems that so many of us have. And yet Jesus says they are blessed. Well, within the whole of the Sermon on the Mount, we get to understand exactly what Jesus is getting at here. You see, at the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, just to pull back for us and paint the picture of what Jesus is saying here and why they are blessed. At the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus almost makes an altar call. You see, chapters 5, 6, and 7 are rigorous, they're intense. You read it and you might squirm reading the Sermon on the Mount and wonder, what's Jesus getting at here? Does he really want us to live this out? And at the very end, he makes an altar call. He says, so what I've taught you is hard, and you're going to make a choice. You're either going to choose the narrow path, the harder path, or the wide one. You're either going to choose the narrow gate or the wide gate. You're going to choose the road that leads to life, and it might be more challenging, or you're going to choose a road that leads to death and destruction. And he creates these juxtapositions. He even talks about the wise and the foolish builder. And so basically at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he says, so which one are you going to be? Are you going to choose the road that leads to life? Or are you going to choose the road that leads to death? Are you going to be a wise builder, or are you going to be a foolish builder? See what Jesus is doing. You see what Jesus is doing here is he's asking his listeners to make a decision. A decision on what? To follow him no matter what. To follow him even when injustices come. To follow him even when you are poor and suffering. To follow him even when persecution comes. To follow him even when it seems like culture around you wants to eat you alive. To follow him even when the world seems as though it has been ripped out from underneath you. To follow him even when the floodwaters rise and you can barely catch your breath. To follow him when you are gasping for air. To follow him no matter what. And what we discover is that those people who decide to follow him no matter what discover what it means to be blessed. So the blessed life isn't about what we have or don't have, but the blessed life is those who discover the richness of following the ways of Jesus, no matter what life may bring.
Hey, thanks so much for watching this video. I'm J.D. Walt and I work for Seedbed, and our mission is to gather, connect, resource, and commission the people of God to sow for a great awakening. We would love for you to join us. If your heart is our heart, hey, we'd love for you to subscribe to this video, like it, share it with others. Thank you so much.